Hello everyone, lecture 4 in this course of lectures entitled Thought as Word Dynamics, and now we're getting into the meat, the flesh itself, by moving towards the first chapter. I've produced in the first 3 lectures some introductions, the first being historical, the second being an overall reflection on what I attempted to do, and the third lecture was a comment on the table of contents, on a summary, on the abstract of the book, where I would say the overall topic is being presented very quickly, but just to give an idea of the architecture of the lectures, and that was in lecture number 3, the current being number 4. So let's go about it. First chapter in the first section, first section being entitled Overall Principles. There are very few chapters in that presentation, and you will see what is getting addressed is very broad general questions like about the plausibility of describing thought as dynamics over a network of words. First chapter, speech acts are generated as the outcome of a dynamics operating on a network. So in this first chapter, I'm establishing the rationality, why it is a valid hypothesis to regard that the thought process is actually the activation of a network. At the time I started discussing, reflecting on that and working on artificial intelligence, which is 1987, the idea was less familiar than it is now, because now there's a lot of evidence that that is actually the case. But because my approach is not a top-down but a bottom-up approach, it's not bad that I go over again and systematically over that idea of a network being the substrate, the infrastructure on which thought operates. That general hypothesis that speech acts are generated as the outcome of a dynamics operating on a network is specific when it states that the data, the words, summoned in the generation of speech acts are structured into a network. It is also informative when it distinguishes 2 parts to the mechanism: a statics, being the network itself, and the dynamics that I will not qualify immediately, and the dynamics operating on that network. It is somewhat trivial, however, in many other respects, because one may wonder, indeed, if there's any logical alternative at all to the way the hypothesis is reformulated. For example, speech performance unfolds in time and is therefore out of necessity a dynamic process. Also, any dynamics necessarily operates on a substrate constituting its statics. In the case of speech performance, the statics automatically comprises the building bricks of speech acts, i.e. the words that get combined sequentially into speech acts. About the nature of the statics, unless the full complexity of speech performance is assigned to its dynamics, some of its structure is bound to reflect the static organization of the data. Sure, there is no compelling reason for considering that these are structured at all. The converse hypothesis cannot even be dispelled, that speech performance results from an extremely complex dynamics operating on unstructured data. Sentences being generated through picking individual words one at a time on demand from a repository where they are randomly stored. So the idea of an organization, which is the infrastructure of speaking, is a particular hypothesis, because it would be possible to imagine an alternative where words are just there floating around in our brain, not being organized according to a network, and are just being picked one at a time when we speak. We can even imagine at a sub-symbolic level that it's only sounds that are there, and that we pick sounds one after another in a big bag where they sit. I defend here the idea that there is some organization, a static organization between words before we start speaking, before we start uttering a particular sentence. At the same time, the converse hypothesis of an organization would suppose a highly uneconomical method for dealing with the task of generating a sequentially organized input. The idea of a bag where words are floating around is very uneconomic, and we know that in nature things usually get organized in one way or another. This would be unexpected, as it has been observed that as soon as biological processes reach some level of complexity, the complexity spreads between the substrate and the dynamics operating on it. The process that I've just described is called emergence, and it is due to self-organization. The words are organized in a manner or other in their repository. One avenue for modeling such organization is to represent it by the mathematical object known as a graph, which is a set of ordered pairs. If you think of a network, you can represent a network mathematically as a graph, which is a set of ordered pairs. The pairs the pairs represent the edges in the graph, and the pair is a number or whatever associated to the two nodes which are linked by the particular edge or arc within the graph. A connected graph is a graph where you can go from any place to any other place within the graph. A connected graph is what one refers to in non-technical terms as being a network. And we'll show later on that the connectedness of the graph is a condition for the rationality of the speech acts being uttered. I'll go back to that repeatedly, and because I think it's important to underline that the way I've approached things has some consequences also in terms of modeling the operation of the mind as far as its pathology is concerned too. There are things I will say about the organization of the network and of the graph that represent it that have implications about what is the phenomenon of neurosis and what is the phenomenon of psychosis. A connected graph is what one refers to in non-technical terms as being a network. In other words, saying that the dynamics of speech performance operates on a network amounts to saying simply that its substrate of words is in some way and in some degree organized. That's the point I've just been making about the opposite, the contrasting hypothesis that we have in our head or anywhere else access to a bag where words are there lying around, and that we connect them at the time we think or speak. Neurosis corresponds to the less dramatic circumstances when individual words are, as I will show later on. In psychosis, only part of the lexicon is available at any one time for speech performance, and in neurosis, that corresponds to the less dramatic circumstances when individual words and therefore particular parts in the network are inaccessible, the whole lexicon remaining accessible, sometimes though through convoluted and cumbersome ways. That's the process that we observe in the case of neurosis. I will get back to that because the whole process of neurosis and psychosis deserve to be described in their own section in an elaborate way later on. So far for the first chapter. Let's move now to the second chapter. The second chapter is about this network is stored in the human brain. As I said already, there is a likelihood that the network we use for speech generation is located in the brain, but I prefer to get there as a deduction, a hypothesis which has been examined and validated to facts that will actually support the hypothesis. It is clear that speech acts are produced from within a talking subject, as it is the mouth that utters them. And at the same time, when we think, we very much have the feeling, we're under the impression that it happens somewhere in our head, okay? This does not imply, out of necessity, that the network mentioned, along with its data, is stored within the talking subject. It can, however, be inferred that such is indeed the case, essentially for lack of a viable alternative. And the viable alternative I will examine before discarding it. Suppose that the network were located elsewhere than within the talking subject, meaning that the substrate to speech acts lies outside his body, or his or her body. Then there would need to be, for the talking subject, some means through which he or she communicates with this outer network, either that this external source acts as a sender or the speaker as a receiver, or that the talking subject can tap the source from a distance. Quite interestingly, it is a distinctive feature of those individuals that the majority of humans regard as mentally deranged, that they postulate the existence of such an outside source for speech acts and claim that their words or their inner speech is being interfered with by an obtrusive sender. And I'll get back to that process. In section 21, I will show later why it should be expected from a network whose connectedness is broken that it assumes that it cannot be itself the source of the speech performance it utters. With connectedness lost, the disconnected parts of the network have ceased to communicate. They generate speech independently. The emergence of speech acts from another part of the network is perceived as being from an external source by every other part. And I'll get back to that. If there is an external source of speech performance, whether it is acting as a sender or constitutes a repository accessed by the talking subject, there should be some circumstances where the communication is broken or at least impaired because of some physical obstacle interfering with it. Such impairments can be observed in the case of any electromagnetic waves. Only gravitational waves are supposedly immune to blockage, but their existence remains hypothetical. Nothing of the sort is observed with speech performance. Individuals swimming at the very bottom of the ocean, walking on the moon, or prisoners of a lead-coated concrete bunker don't show any reduction in their capacity for speech. Their speech performance might be impaired by the circumstances, but in this case, other causes are more likely candidates than distance from a sender, lack of oxygenation of the brain, sense deprivation, etc. It is therefore reasonable to assume that the network acting as a substrate for speech performance, i.e. containing words, is internal to the subject. Once admitted that the network is located within the talking subject, its likely container needs unambiguously to be the brain. Indeed, lesions to the brain, being accidental or clinically performed, as well as other types of interference, do impair speech performance in very general or in very specific ways. There is by now an abundant literature starting in the 19th century that the likes of Paul Broca or Wernicke initiated, showing what consequences in terms of aphasia or agnosia, i.e. impairments in speech performance or thinking of various natures, specific lesions of the brain induce or interfere with its functioning. See the works of Sachs, of Damasio and Damasio, who have popularized such accounts. Let us notice, however, that such observations taken in isolation are insufficient to invalidate the hypothesis of the externality of the network. It could be indeed that lesions simply hinder reception from an external sender or impair the brain's capacity at tapping an outer repository. It is only once admitted as most plausible that the body of the talking subject holds a network, being the substrate for the speech performance, that the brain shows to be the probable location for it. Beyond this, the deductive probability, is there any further plausibility for the brain containing the type of network we're having in mind? There is indeed. The brain is known to contain a network constituted of nerve cells or neurons. In the coming lectures, I will constantly check if the network I'm talking about here in these lectures and the one made out of nerve cells in our brain can possibly be the same. That's okay for today, and I'll see you next time when you come and join me for lecture number 5. See you soon.